Offer my thanks to my friend Ishaq. I cannot see him here, but Ishaq invited, there he is. Ishaq invited me to today's conference. I should note, Ishaq, that Harvard, before I got here to Tunisia, emailed me and said they're very worried about the state of affairs in Tunisia, and please check with Ishaq Diwan and Mohammed Al-Aisais to make sure they're okay as well. So even though you're not full-time with us, we still care about you. I also want to thank Professor Ahmed Galal, of whom I've long been an admirer, for conceptualizing this, and to the staff of the ERF, especially to Neda Ramaj and Huda Azmi, who single-handedly, in my view, disproved the stereotype of Egyptians as disorganized. I can say this because I am an Egyptian. To me, they are almost Germanic in how organized they are and how precise and punctual they've been. And in fact, I was thinking, I just came from Cairo, I was thinking that President Sisi should hand over management of at least one of his big mega projects to Huda or Neda, then maybe one of them might actually have a chance of succeeding. I also, before I start, and I hope this isn't going to be counted against me, I just do want to say something about this really extraordinary country at this very difficult time. I know we've all watched with horror the tragedy of the last few days, and our hearts are all with the victims and their families. For those of us who study democracy and democratization, we know that democratic reversals, right, the backsliding of new democracies back into authoritarianism, these kinds of reversals have often been triggered by fears of terrorism and state collapse. One has reason to be worried about democracy in a country like Tunisia when things like this happen. But although my head is worried, tells me to be worried, for some reason my heart tells me not to fear for Tunisia, that Tunisia is going to be fine. And so I can only say, Tahiyya Tunis wa Tahiyya Demokratiyyah. Okay. So let me start with what I was asked to talk about today. So the question that motivates this panel is what makes one form of democracy more successful than another? And true perhaps to the mission of the Economic Research Forum, success here is measured in terms of economic outcomes. So specifically I was asked to consider the extent to which variation in economic outcomes can be attributed to variation in the way that democratic institutions are designed. And we're asking, does the presence or absence of things like separated powers, like you would have in a presidency, versus fused powers between the legislative and the executive, as you'd have in a parliamentary system, does that have some effect on development? Does the way in which parliamentarians are chosen have an effect on development, whether you choose them according to a system of proportional representation or majority rule? So we're asking whether these rococo variations in forms of democracy can actually lead to big, long-term economic outcomes. So in the 25 or so minutes that I have, I want to do three things. First, I want to offer one provocation. I'm actually just going to offer a bunch of provocations. So the first provocation I'm going to offer is that I'm going to say that this question of whether macro-level political institutions have an impact on economic development is ultimately of limited real-world value or even interest. Then I'm, true to being a political scientist, I'm going to try to redirect our attention from the hypothesized economic effects of political institutions to the potential political effects of political institutions. So here, particularly, I want to interrogate the claim that particular configurations of rules and structures make democratic governments more likely to survive. And here, too, I want to offer a provocation, which is that political institutions, I think, are almost as inconsequential in their political effects as they are in their economic ones. And I'm going to go out on a limb and try to illustrate this position or give some support for it by examining some evidence from the Tunisian and Egyptian cases, recognizing full well that if we were to rank everybody here in this room in terms of their knowledge on Tunisia, I would certainly not be at the top. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some reflections about what we do know about the relationship between institutions and democracy. So to start with the question that actually motivates this panel, do varieties of democratic political institutions have long-term effects on a country's developmental prospects? There is actually a huge literature on this. or at least on the economic effects of political institutions. So we have, for example, a vigorous debate over whether democracy or dictatorship is better for development and growth, with scholars such as the late Mansur Olson, who argued that democracy should grow faster because leaders in democracies have an incentive to tax less than autocrats who are always going to tax up to the revenue maximizing rate. Others have made the argument, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, that democracy should actually grow more slowly because voters in a democracy are going to force their leaders to divert resources from investment to consumption. However, in the most thorough and, in my view, definitive study conducted by one of our speakers here today, Adam Przeworski, I've never met, I met Professor Przeworski when I was a graduate student. I doubt he'd remember, but I was telling somebody the other day that I don't think I've ever written anything that didn't cite him. Professor Przeworski wrote this big book with several co-authors, and they basically interrogated this claim that, about the differences in democracy and development's democracy and dictatorship's potential to produce development, and they found, look, there's not really a significant difference in the level of growth that these regime types are able to promote. There is some slight differences in the patterns, but no real differences in the level of growth. So here's what this suggests for the purposes of this talk today. So if something as big as democracy and dictatorship, if a difference as stark as that is found to have little impact on growth and development, then it seems highly unlikely that more limited variations within the democratic regime subtype would have big developmental consequences. I'll stick a pin in that point. There is, however, a big literature that tries to convince us, in fact, that there are developmental or economic consequences to these variations now within democratic regime types. So I'm just going to give some examples of it. So, for example, a couple of scholars, Ronald Dabrowski and Mark Kaiser, looked at price levels, and they found that it turns out that consumer prices in majoritarian electoral systems in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, where we elect our parliamentarians by means of majority vote as opposed to proportional representation, turns out that in places like that, prices are lower, and that's because there's a higher seat-to-vote elasticity in majoritarian systems than in proportional representation systems, because in majoritarian systems we really want to get 50 plus 1% of the vote, so that extra vote really matters, and so in a majoritarian system we're going to be much more beholden to consumers than we would be in a proportional representation system. So that's one potential economic effect. Kathy Bond and Francis Rosenbluth found that in parliamentary systems with proportional representation, you tend to have much bigger government budgets than in parliamentary systems with something like a majority rule, because it turns out that when you're trying to cement a government coalition, it requires a lot of horse trading and pork barrel politics, and so that tends to increase spending. Others have looked at the relationship between forms of democracy and corruption. So Person and Tavellini argued that it turns out that in presidential systems, you should have less corruption because the president is more accountable, the executive is more accountable, whereas Yana Kunikova and Susan Rose Ackerman found the exact opposite. They said that, in fact, when you have a president who's in control of the government, they can generate rent-seeking opportunities for personal gain. Others have looked at the relationship between electoral rules and corruption. So Person, Cavallini, and Trevi found that when you have big electoral districts and closed-list proportional representation, you tend to have more corruption because parliamentarians are not accountable, whereas when you have majoritarian systems or open lists, such that when the voter goes to the polls, he has to vote for a particular candidate's name, that those candidates then become much more accountable when they're in office and less corrupt. However, there's recent work on Indonesia and in Brazil where you have open list proportional representation, and the argument there is that that actually tends to enhance corruption. So, there's no agreement, right, on any of these things. It's also the case that none of this is about economic development per se, but I guess it's a kind of short intellectual hop from things like price levels or government budgets or corruption to something like long-run economic development. Okay, so even though I find this literature really fascinating, I don't believe that these findings, in as much as they can be called findings, offer much that we can do with in the real world. And that's because even if we could agree on what the economic effects of things like parliamentarism or presidentialism or majority rule or proportional representation, even if we could agree on what their economic effects were, it's unlikely that political institutions would ever be chosen on the basis of those economic effects. So to put it more clearly, political institutions of the sort that we're asked to talk about in this panel are almost never selected because of their long-run economic optimality. They're selected because the most powerful actors in the processes of institution formation want them or agree to them. Now you're going to come back to me and say, well, maybe the powerful actors want them or agree to particular institutions precisely because of their beliefs about those institutions' effects on economic development. And clearly this is possible, although I think the inconclusive nature of our understanding of just how these institutions, what their economic effects are, really militates against that conclusion. And it's more likely, in my view, that political actors' preferences over political institutions are based on the political effects of those institutions. So if we were to think back on the constitution writing moments in this country, Tunisia, or in Egypt, which is the country that I study most closely, we're likely to find that when the framers were trying to determine whether to endow their country with a presidential or a parliamentary system, or whether to conduct elections according to some version of proportional representation, or according to some form of majority rule, the things that mattered most to them were who would be empowered, advantaged, or disempowered by these institutions. If we were to look at the minutes of the meetings from the Tunisia Hayat al-Ulya al-Tahqiq Ahdaf al-Thawra, the Tunisian Higher Council for the Fulfillment of Revolutionary Goals, or the Constituent Assembly in this country, the Constituent Assembly in Egypt, I'm willing to bet all of the money in my very limited bank account that we would not find anybody who argued for a particular set of democratic institutions based on some idea of the long-run prospects for growth conferred by that institution. Instead, we'd find things like revolutionaries who want to trim the power of the ancien regime. We'd find Islamists who want to trim the power of seculars. We'd find secularists who want to trim the power of Islamists. And we'd find all of them proposing or defending political institutions that they felt would do this fundamentally political work for them. Now, I don't want to say that that means that things like electoral rules don't have economic effects, only that these are, at best, in my view, happy or unhappy side effects. So, I don't see any scenario in which, for example, social scientists, having, discovered the growth potential conferred by particular sets of political institutions, could get political actors to choose such institutions even if they didn't serve their political interests. So, consequently, I believe this entire line of inquiry, while it's important, it's fundamentally, and I think in the best sense of the word, academic. Okay. So far, here's what I've told you. I've told you that political institutions are chosen by politicians, and that politicians are primarily concerned with acquiring and maintaining power. So you may think that I would then validate the perspective that important political outcomes hinge upon the kind of political institutions that are chosen in a new democracy's founding moments. And so this brings me to the second provocation that I want to make today, which is that I'm actually very skeptical of the argument that the survival or the flourishing of democracy actually has anything to do with the particular institutions that you choose. And in the remainder of this talk, I want to illustrate the reasons for my skepticism by doing something that a lot of people have been doing lately, and not, in my view, terribly well, and that is comparing the divergent trajectories of Egypt and Tunisia after their respective revolutions in the early weeks of 2011. Because as we know, in this great country, you've managed to establish and maintain representative democracy, while Egypt has had a more troubled path, which involved legislative and presidential elections won by illiberal Islamists, who were later barred from office by court order, and then ultimately mass protest and military intervention. So today, Egypt is in this strange position where it has an elected president, but it doesn't have a legislature, and we could probably debate where Egypt is heading. Some might be more or less optimistic, but there's no question that as of today, the country does not yet meet the minimum standard for a completed democratic transition defined by Juan Lentz and Al Stepan as having an elected government that actually has de facto power to rule. So now, I will say that I'm uneasy doing this comparison between Egypt and Tunisia because they're so different, right? I mean, Tunisia has fewer inhabitants than the capital city of Egypt. And we also have degrees of freedom problem here, right? We have many potential explanations for the divergent outcomes between these two cases, but we only have two cases. So it's not clear that we're going to actually be able to adjudicate between rival hypotheses, even if we pay very careful attention to the sequencing of the transitions in each place. That said, I'm still going to try to do it. So in the interest of time, I'm actually just going to focus on one explanation for the divergence between these two places. And it's an explanation that I've heard a lot, and it actually hinges on institutional design. And this is the argument that Tunisia's relative success and Egypt's relative difficulty are functions of the electoral systems that were chosen at each country's post-revolutionary founding moment. In Tunisia's case by the Higher Council for the Fulfillment of Revolutionary Goals and the Electoral Commission, and in Egypt's by the military government in consultation with the country's political parties. So, as you know, now I can show my slide. So, as you know, in both Egypt and Tunisia, you had elections in late 2011. So, in Tunisia, we had elections in October of 2011 for the Constituent Assembly, and in Egypt, we had elections from November to 2011 to January of 2012 for its parliament. You can see from this slide, I mean, not a terribly well-designed slide, but the point is, in Tunisia, lots of parties. The biggest plurality party, as everybody here, I'm sure knows, is the Harakat al-Nahda, the Nahda Movement Party, which had around 40% of the seats. In Egypt, the picture looks sort of similar. I should next time put percentages on the y-axis. Picture looks sort of similar in that there is again a dominant party. In this case, it's the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. And then in second place was actually another conservative Islamic party called Hizb an-Nur. Now the difference is that in Tunisia, the majority of seats, even though it's not apparent from this badly designed graph, the majority of seats actually go to non-Islamists. Okay? In the Egyptian case, the majority of seats actually go to Islamists. Okay. And I think this is important because these charts, I think, tell us something about the nature of the political landscape in these countries. In Tunisia, there was a relative balance between Islamists and non-Islamists. In Egypt, there was no such thing. Islamists really dominated the post-revolutionary moment. And we know from the literature on democratic transitions that goes all the way back to Dankwart Rostow, O'Donnell and Schmitter, Professor Jaworski. We've long recognized that democracy emerges and is sustained only when there's a balance of contending political forces, such that none is strong enough to impose its preferred political project on the others, and none is so weak that it just decides to withdraw from the democratic game entirely and play the spoiler. In the Islamist case, in the Egyptian case, the Islamists were so dominant, they had a supermajority in the Egyptian legislature, that if you were an Egyptian liberal and you're looking at this, you're thinking to yourself, elections really are a fool's game, they're just a delivery system for these religious retrogrades, and consequently you're going to be inclined to seek the military's aid and protection. In the Tunisian case, in contrast, the Islamists did well, but the majority went to non-Islamists, so the losers in Tunisia had actually less incentive than the losers in Egypt to seek to upset the entire democratic chessboard, because they could be reasonably assured that in some future round, if they could just get their act together, they might actually be able to win the right to govern. Now, I don't want to romanticize the Tunisian transition or abstract away from some of the